starting trouble.
Hey.
So how's it going, Ryan?
Okay, how are you?
How's your holidays? Good?
They were, yeah. How about you? Busy, hectic.
You know
stay
what?
put? Do you travel? Where you
No, we went to my one's house for Christmas dinner.
Is somebody in charge sitting here?
You.
go? You.
You are sitting there. Well, thanks, everyone, for coming out this evening, and this is our next committee meeting in the lineup of our discussion. And if I may say, I think some wheels have been turning in your minds right over the last several weeks. Thank you for talking about things with AJ last month. And we've had a chance to even think about a few more things, and want to give you time to be able to share with the group some of your ideas. But there are a couple of things related to build out I'd like to just touch upon, if I may, before we do that broader discussion, if that's all right. We took another shot here at some discussion. And I can hand these out, and I do have a hole punch for later on if you don't use it. So there are 6 areas
Thank you.
where we have been considering over this, 8,000 and some acres. I think we were ultimately knowing that that's some very low density land or vacant land along there. Some of it is having residential sort of land use and pattern to it. Some of it is non-residential or zoned that way. And these 6 areas are ones where we try to generally think about some of the either topography patterns or road patterns. Ultimately, I think one of the things you guys were thinking about sort of towards the end of that discussion it was about how does this all sort of feed into 30 or some of the other roads along the perimeter of the township. So I'm going to let you into our minds a little bit, and then we can think about sort of how these 6 areas may be of interest in the planning process as we keep moving forward. So we did have some considerations for if this land would be residential in the future, or if it would be non-residential in the future, or a mix of that. There would be that constrained land, right? I think last time you were talking about not all of this land is something that can be developed. Some of it has natural resources to it. You guys also talked about sort of that general pattern. If you just look across over time and the records that are done with the permits and things, that it's generally about an acre plus for each dwelling unit, and that takes into account the vehicles, the infrastructure, the whole types of things. And then, of course, the big one of some trips, vehicle trips, right, and what that kind of means. So I'm going to do the next piece. That's just the introduction to it all. Thank you. So if we think about sort of modeling, because ultimately, right, the comprehensive plan is this long range look and the consideration for what kinds of things are happening. You can, this sheet with the green on it looks at and just spells out the assumptions that I just made. We then took a look at some things in terms of, there are 2 sheets here, build out modeling, mapping, and there's an area A through an area F. So we tied sort of just some calculations. We're trying to get an idea. of what in each of these areas there could be for these types of things. Is this something you prefer I put up? I can, or, yeah, it's for record and the other members. I have the paper copies.
Okay,
Either
that's
way.
fine, paper copies.
Okay. So, we realized that really, with the flexibility of how you would ultimately want to approach the density of potential areas down the road, we're trying to get an understanding, if we took all 6 of these areas and sort of compared them to one another, what their potential impact to the whole system, to the whole build-out would be. Now, what it does in our 8,000 and some acres, if really about 40% of that we're having, these resources, we have about 60% of that land left. So let's just roughly say 5,000 acres. And that would give us between 5,000 and 6,000 dwelling units if it were all residential. Maybe it's not all residential, right? But if we went to that high side. And that's a lot. Then we consider how you have the number of people that you have now, and if that kind of pattern were to continue forward, what that would do, right? And then also what it would do for the increase, whether trips end up going to Route 30 or going other places, that this is something that if you were to have discussions down the road, or we're anticipating you're going to have down the road with PennDOT, how this kind of development build-out, right, would ultimately affect that corridor. Now, one of the very interesting things is that there have been a certain set of, I'll say, studies. We're not the traffic engineers, but when you combine that with the planning side of things, that it's not about adding lanes. It's about fixing some of the efficiencies or potential, like the intersections with those roads. And I think, Harry, you brought that up quite a number of meetings ago. So the way in which there's the potential for residential development, we also thought about the potential for non-residential development. And if you don't mind, could you give us a crack into some of the thoughts that you've been having about some land uses in the last couple of weeks as well? Do you mind sharing that with the group?
No.
Because I think that we've got quite a number of things we could consider here.
So I saw, it's the Westmoreland Heritage Trail System, I believe. It goes from Trafford out through Slickville. This area used to have a trolley system and smaller railroad systems. The rail beds are still there, the tracks are not. So looking into like a rails to trails for this area, you could tie in a lot of the neighborhoods and parks with existing rail beds. And there's millions of dollars in grants out there that helps with land acquisition and building that. You could essentially go from Trafford to Manor all on a trail and spider out from there to tie into some of the other parks in the township. I just went crazy with the highlighter, but if you want to see what I came up with, you take a look for yourself.
I think one of the other things that I saw in your as you're putting your thoughts down on the paper was the fact that some of the land use possibilities that go sort of hand in hand with this idea also are ones that could either have sort of a residential, non-residential mix in some of these areas.
So the other thing is around the parks, the bigger parks, is putting in higher density housing so they get their green space and walking distance. Also kind of ties in with the trail system potentially, and like an RIDC type thing, and like Ardera area, which would tie in with that trail as well. So people living in that area could bike to work, and you're keeping people in town, in the township, and giving them some sort of leisure or recreation to do.
I think you probably would be in that book category of retrofitting suburbia right there, right? I mean, that's, it is a book title. But that, I think, actually, the potential for what you're talking about has a lot of legs. And the realities of it, it's been done in quite a number of places. And I think the areas you've also identified are ones that have the infrastructure, right? They've been extended into a good number of those areas. So the kind of expense that would go along with that would not necessarily be as high, right? Because you're almost sort of doing an infill, if I may. And that's a pretty noble kind of thing to do. I don't know if anybody has had a similar or parallel thought to it, or sees this as something with some other potential or questions about it.
But also, I think it'd be like something that you work together with, Irwin, North Irwin, Manor, Trafford, the neighboring municipalities that could potentially tie into. You have more communities involved, you potentially get more of it funded.
Mm-hmm.
I have a photo, so I can get it out to everybody, scan it to everybody as well. So I guess if in any of the last couple of weeks after you guys had last met, if you want to send it down there. Was there anybody that had a chance to either talk over in the last couple of weeks with their neighbor or with anyone sort of about these ideas? Because there have been some folks in the December timeframe, actually, that have gone back to the survey and shared some more information with us. We're now up to about 950 people that are participating. Yeah. And so I think that there are some people who are still looking at things in very different ways, right? I mean, just as we had back in the fall. And I think, though, this idea of having a housing product that's within a reachable scale, right, for some folks is high on the list when they're thinking about that. So in terms of where density and quality and desire, can all sort of, those three can converge all at the same time. And maybe that's something that along these corridors could be a particular kind of interest to folks. Wanting some more mobility, right? We were talking about mobility. Has anybody walked any of those corridors over time, or out of just,
I haven't.
have not? Well, maybe our next meeting should be a long gathering spot, and we can do that, or meet up. So in total, I'm sorry, were you talking about the acreages, the mileage, excuse me?
I don't recall what it is. I want to say it's like 20 some miles that goes from Trafford through Murraysville, Slickville, through there. I read it's like 20 some miles.
So if North Huntington had the opportunity to hook into that system, in sort of just even doing an out and back, you've got upwards of 50 plus miles. That's quite a trip. It's quite a journey, right? For people. So how far do you take your bike presently?
I usually do 20 miles, so that's either like a 10-mile out and back, 12 miles. I mean, I can do up to maybe 30.
How far do you travel to get onto a trail?
The closest is Little Boston, so
Hmm.
and I live on Madison
Fun,
Township, so I can be there in like 15 minutes. But
Okay.
if I could be there, if I could be at a trail in less than 15 minutes, that would be nice too.
Okay.
So
And I think, was it the borough was also having some consideration for what, maybe some
I was-
connectivity they could
I was talking
have?
to one of the members down there, and we were talking, brainstorming about that, and then, you know, light bulb came on. That's whenever I went with this through the township and into the other communities.
Marked up your map.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I noticed, like, because I ride through a lot of these, like, trail towns and, like, places that sort of have kind of blossomed as a result of, like, West Newton, for instance. I don't know if you guys been through there, but, like, it's really cute. There's all kinds of nice little places for the bike people to stop and hang out along the way. It's a wonderful day to just spend your day kind of going along and stopping off at the bike towns, having a little drink, hanging out.
So before this evening, before this afternoon, how many of us have walked into a room here and thought North Huntington is a trail town?
Potential's
We have a
there.
lot of hiking trails to take advantage of.
Pardon me?
We have a fair number of hiking trails around the area that I drag the kids.
Yeah, so this one may not be as much terrain for it, right?
No,
But,
this is a
distance.
really nice idea, because like I know my parents will go from spot to spot to ride different portions of the trail and just spend the day in different areas, so it's a good idea.
So from the consideration of even how this could come to be, because I bet, Harry, your gears are moving up here, right, as in terms of the ways in which, and Ryan, in terms of even in ordinance side of things, maybe even, you know, how some of this could fold into if there were, you know, development that were put forward and that kind of tie-in or connection into it. But I think this is pretty exciting. I think the other one is that from an extension of your, calling it an extension of Parks and Recreation for you know, the purpose of this evening, I think that's, would be something that you all may not be as a township, those needing to, you're not the sole group. The opportunity to join up with some other groups, because there are quite a number of communities where that is a sort of a partnership, or in several cases in municipalities where there is a sort of a cooperation with a group specifically focused on, I mean, that effort of getting the trails in place, and even up to the maintenance of them, right? Because I think that would be a time element from an operations standpoint. But throughout this region, in what, the last 1999, when it really started to take off, I think, sort of that whole system, region-wide, it's now was kind of a discussion in front of us. This is, anyone else with some thoughts on this one? This is,
I think it's a good idea, because remember, the people that leave North Huntington, go on these trails, people from the other end, West Newton, are going to come back here on the same trail and visit this area too. So you have to think about it as a two-way street, and everybody will be winners, because people from up that way are going to go down the trail at that end and come here to visit whatever they want to, or if you put things out there, people will visit them. As the story goes, if you build it, they will come. But that's a two-way street. I think it's going to benefit the community here, and it's also going to benefit residents from another community that ride that trail coming this way.
I think the other thing that it starts to do is it starts to chip away a little bit at that discussion that you guys had back in December about some of the traffic generation that would otherwise occur.
Right.
And, you know, displace it a little bit of it, or redirect it, maybe depending upon what, you know, where, if these are areas of mixed use or they're areas of residential, and that connection you just made to, there are plenty of businesses when that kind of amenity is available, what they are doing either with their employee base and, or, I mean, just their workforce base, meaning how far people are coming, right? We started weeks ago, or months ago, in the discussions about what this attraction was to get all the way up to Cranberry compared to this interchange stop. And we've actually made quite a shift in the scale of discussion, and actually internalizing some, I think strengthening.
Yeah, you're not
That
getting
piece.
cars put on the road for people to come here.
Right, so if they're
They're gonna
making
get
that
here through a
workplaces
bike trail
accessible.
on a bicycle.
Yes. There
And
are
I think
folks,
that's a win-win thing.
there are folks that I know that live in Oakmont that will drive a little bit, and then they will get as far on the northern reaches that they can, and then they will pedal in to the city of Pittsburgh and then down toward Homestead, right? And so they knock off quite a number of those miles of their trip, and
Right.
they start exercising their legs and their brain every morning and every afternoon. It's just a different way of doing it.
Yeah,
So-
I think it's a good avenue to look into. I think that's a very productive issue that we could address or try to address, because the way I see it, if people don't have to drive to a car here and get here on a bicycle, you know, that's less traffic coming in, but you're still getting the people here.
All right. A whole new arm.
Yeah,
of
most of the neighborhoods
recreation.
have a park that's close by, and if they're all connected, you could walk to the next park or ride to the next park, run to the next park, because every park has a different type of amenity. They're not all the same, so you might go to the next one.
Can even build that into some of the programming that the Park and Recreation System does. And then this whole notion of kids, students, young folk, that want to go visit somebody. They aren't relying upon having necessarily, if it's over, over the hill or down the way to visit someone else, not needing to rely upon necessarily someone else to get them there. So, well, this is pretty exciting. I think that also areas, just looking at the map quickly, you're not down into areas D and E, but we've got A, B, C, and F, correct? Could probably
It
connect
could tie
into-
into possibly D and E
Okay.
easily. F, that'd be a stretch, depending on like topography and
Mm-hmm.
roadways and stuff, but I mean, anything can be done.
So we've got that northern reach for certain, and then a portion of the southern.
Mm.
Okay. Okay, so I think, we were also thinking about, from this last discussion, sort of this sense, again, of build-out and the kinds of services, if anyone, through your discussions, not just in the last couple of weeks, but sort of through the course of this fall, if we could go back almost to some of the considerations for what people have that priority for in the community, and how we get at some these notions of additional housing. And I'd like to start to think about, if we could, some different kinds of housing, this different, like this continuum of housing, right? The different housing products. Because as you continue to grow, and I think we had maybe 2 meetings or so ago, the discussion about sort of what some of the, and the feedback that we've gotten, sort of the housing prices and things like that, and sort of what those different scales of housing are. And if anybody had any further discussions with anyone along the way about that, because ultimately that would be fitting into how we look at either some densities in different areas potentially, or if we look into even the kinds of land use permissions, meaning the residential dwelling types that go into some of the different districts, or even ultimately coming out of this, some updates to the zoning ordinance if we need to, sort of broaden anything within those district offerings, the types of housing. So, anybody had anybody specific that they've had discussions with or brought up at a holiday get-together?
Let's
gonna say, just
comprehensive plan going?
nothing specific recently, but it seems like in the past, developers would have an idea to have sort of a mixed development with mixed housing, whether it's townhomes, apartments, and single family all in the same development. But then when it's time to build and they're selling lots, the complaint we'd hear from the developers is that there's no market for townhouses, or people in townhouses don't want to look across the street at single family homes and vice versa. So we've had a couple developers sort of steer away from that type of development. What seems to be pretty steady is we call it single family attached, and it's basically a 2-unit building with a property line going down the middle. So we do have those, and those tend to do well on the market per the developers. So, but I like your idea about like a townhouse complex. Like we don't, excuse me, we don't have many of those.
No, and there's a lot of them going in, like at Hempfield, Greensburg area. They're going up everywhere.
Yeah, and North Hills. I mean, you
It's-
take a ride in the North Hills, you see them all
It's
over
real
the place.
condensed, and like my aunt just bought one,
Mm-hmm.
and she lives in one of those units, and she's older, doesn't have to take care of the property.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's right there. It's a pretty big complex. That's all it is.
Yeah. And another thing is we've never had like HOAs in the township. For whatever reason, certain developers wanted to steer away from that too. So we don't have active HOAs that are governing these communities. Those just sort of fall to the wayside.
Okay, so if, not to just go into, too high-level planning, but I think there are a couple things that really are sort of connections that just happen in these kinds of discussions based on a region and based on just sort of the nature of what some of this housing is. And I think you brought up, if one of your family members is doing this, and she may be of a certain age where it's not her age, it's her desire to have a certain level of care. I think AJ raised his hand last time, or you may have been talking about one of the things, and he was in the camp of not wanting to take care of so much property and things
Right.
like that, right? So he may be a little younger than your aunt, but that whole consideration. I think the interesting part to me also is that from the things that we've been able to look at and what people have shared on the public, interest side with the survey, is in some cases they are looking for a different product that may be at a different price point. And so that doesn't mean necessarily at one end of it, right? But because, again, the quality and then the convenience or the access, even depending if it's, I'm just going to take the trail concept, if it is in that vicinity, and that is having a certain level of interest where people they don't have a lot of room, say, on their property to have a whole lot of improvements, or just space to spread out and do the pool. They're looking for recreation or relaxing in a different way. And so we could take a look at some of these vacant lands that may be along those corridors and the kinds of densities that could go along, with that. If that's something from a land use mix that we want to try and encourage. I think also when you mix that kind of density from just a numbers standpoint in with such an amenity, that may be an attractive kind of consideration for the development community, especially the regional side or that land use mix side, broaden it a little bit.
Yeah, what are we talking about? Like, you were talking up North Hills, are they high-rises we're talking about, or what type of buildings?
Could be an apartment complex with, 3 stories.
Okay.
Could be
Low
townhouses.
rise.
There's a development, and I don't know much about it. I don't know if it's Ryan Homes, but it's near Bridgeville, like the Hastings. There was an old hospital there, but they took over all this land and started building single-family homes, townhouses. There's restaurants there. There's a bike trail that goes right through there. So it's all kind of coming together in that one spot.
And they do have some highway nearby.
19
highway.
is right nearby,
Right,
yes.
right. But it doesn't need to be right front and center either, right? I mean, it sort of has that consideration for, but if you're also able to make a connection to some of other non-residential, possibly, then that's just a hop, skip, and a jump for people that may be attracted to being on that kind of corridor.
I think that's something we should look into. The more you talk about it, the more interested I am in seeing something like that or looking into it. I think, as you said, there's a demand of, you've experienced it firsthand with a family member. And I assume they're very happy with what
Yeah.
they've gotten. So I think it's something maybe we should look into with our zoning or,
Yeah, their kids moved out, they didn't need a big house, so
Right.
now it's,
there's a lot of that
Yeah.
happening in this area.
right. You wanna keep those people here.
Right. Because if they're looking for it, they have to leave.
Mhm.
And you, I think, then just, I'm gonna go to a potential, if I may, consideration for sort of what may be a guiding statement for this plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can certainly wordsmith this and maybe make it a little bit more formal if we want to, or do all kinds of things. But what I think is important to consider, and we're looking at the first page here with the thing, we'll get to the second page in a minute, is ultimately, we want the long term. You just identified that there's an interest if people want to stay. What do they have the option to do, right? As they maybe grow up their entire lives in the community, is that something where it's going to be having the flexibilities for what different people need at different points in their life? And, what kinds of places within North Huntington or areas and the connections between them are going to exist? So I just sort of started off with a little bit more colloquial, but the game here is that we don't be in it for the long term, right? So there are three aspects, I think, that are significant to some of the things we've been talking about today. One of them is development. You all have continued over year after year to have new development, different paces, different, stages, all those kinds of things, but there is development. One of the biggest words, I think, in this comprehensive plan that becomes an introduction is redevelopment. Because there are going to be things over the next couple of decades to complement the development that continues, that there's going to be change, right, to redevelopment. Whether that comes in the form of replacement or infill or just sort of look at something and start anew, right? And then something that I think has been important to people who have shared through the outreach process to date and some of the things that you guys have hit on even into tonight is sort of this sense of the quality of the open space and the connectivity of it. So that's some sort of grouping as the third leg of our stool, if I may. And the way we set these things up within the plan, we outline the zoning ordinance updates, we consider sort of in some diagramming of where these potential connections or pursuits of sort of feasibility, if you will, of some of these maybe rail trail efforts. That's going to evolve, right? And we may know some things now, but we want this plan to be able to stick with, the evolution over the next couple of years. And part of that evolution is going to be based on what sort of the market demands and then sort of what the community desires. So this was my first shot of us trying to take some of these ideas that we have done, and I don't know if your eyes are telling me that there's some possibility here, sort of with this broad statement, or if there's some other things that you think, sort of just stepping back and looking at the plan as a whole, that maybe we should consider. Anything come to mind? No?
From what I just looked at this, I think this is a very interesting concept called redevelopment. You know, there's a lot of people in this community that want to stay here, but they have these big houses, like a lot of them are building now. In 20 years, they're going to downsize. But the only way they can get out of that is to go to a place like Redstone or somewhere else. But something like, you know, these type of dwellings where maybe there's a center where there could be some shopping for them. They don't have to leave that particular area, but they still remain in the area, which I think I talked to a lot of people that don't want to leave only because their family is still here and they don't want to be separated from them. So I think this is something very interesting to look at.
So on the, I'm going to say on the meter scale, right, one of the things, right, that it sort of goes back and forth. If it is very technically possible, meaning, and quite easily doable from a, you know, a drafting kind of sense, to think about some things for mixed-use redevelopment in some commercial types of, you know, areas.
Yes.
And that does not mean that there is an erase of things. It's a matter, maybe it's an enhancement. Maybe it's actually adding into some of the land uses that are permissible within the commercial areas. And I think if I may just grab onto one thing that you said, and maybe the sense of some of the commercial areas become mixed-use areas where the potential for introducing some levels of residential and having that be non-residential and residential, potentially, right? And
Almost
having
like how the
services.
waterfront's set up.
Well, that
To
is
make-
one way to do it, right? I mean, and I think those,
Just an example.
yeah, those two things are going on there. If they're going on there in one sort of form. There are also some other areas where we don't necessarily have a mall per se,
Right.
but consideration, that same concept,
Yeah.
right, of what is the potential building footprint of a retailer today or even 10 years ago, and then, this isn't every retailer, but some, and what is it potentially in 10 to 15 years from now? Is that same square footage demand that they're gonna have, you know, be the same, or is it going to be different? Does the township have the opportunity to be prepared if it were to be different, right? I think that's where we're going with some of the considerations. And if it were to be different, then what becomes that potential either mix or that reuse or opportunity for expanding upon some of the opportunities that you have? So I think for a little bit today, we've been talking about, right, sort of that residential type of consideration, maybe in residential areas. But also, I think, a consideration for residential in some of your non-residential areas presently that you have may also then, we're talking about sort of the ability for someone to easily access services or products or things like that. The way in which that gets designed or redesigned could be a consideration. I think you would probably follow or be in step with, if I may say, there's Center Township in Beaver County is looking sort of at how retail has changed in their community and what they have a readiness to do. West Mifflin is also, I mean, the borough itself is having a consideration for what is retail doing, and many more. It's a discussion that's alive and well in this region. So, has Planning Commission ever explored any of those discussions specifically?
Not necessarily proactively. I mean,
Okay.
it's just, we have been a reactive municipality, just kind of based on what the developer is proposing, essentially.
So do you think it would be, I'll maybe just give it a scale, it's not a yes or no. But within this comprehensive plan, if we were to outline the types of possibilities of either, a different land use mix, what goes along with that. We don't need to talk about necessarily specific numbers. We could talk about thresholds. We could talk about sort of when different kinds of land uses come together as a mixed use, what that does, what the merits of it are, so that if in time you all had the readiness to, sort of fold those kinds of things in, then you'd have sort of almost like I'd move it beyond to best practices. It's sort of the primer for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I think, because that element, when we start thinking about the potential for that kind of thing, it's not just the square footage of the store or the dwelling or that kind of thing. There's consideration for what does public realm mean, right? Because now there are people potentially living there. They're not living in the middle of a parking lot. They probably don't desire to do so, right? I mean, but what does that mean in terms of connectivity? What's it mean in terms of stormwater? What's it mean? Can some of that be combined? What does it mean sort of in terms of, parking? Is there any opportunity in some of those cases to actually not have such an extensive parking ratio requirement when maybe you have some overlap between some kinds of things, right? Or the peak hour demand. Am I getting too geeky here? Are you planning geeky? But, I mean, these are the kinds of things that even back to your consideration on a smaller scale along these corridors. What does that necessarily mean when you look at parking for that kind of development? It's a different kind of parking. It's bike parking, right? Potential. This is something I think that as we looked through, again, when we're now almost near 950 comments from folks and their participation, they're putting quite a bit on the table for us to sort of peel it back a little bit differently than it has in the past. So, okay. The second sheet, does everybody have a pen? No, I can rustle up some pens. There's a blank line beside some topics here. So the comprehensive plan ultimately is going to have a set of objectives, right? These very broad statements to try and get the policies to work towards things when you're going after different pursuits that you want to ensure you're working towards, right? The objectives any funder also would want to be able to do that. I had a general curiosity that if you, we could take a couple of minutes maybe and think about sort of, if you ranked where you thought some of these topics were, again, up at the top. We did this a few months back, and I just have a general curiosity if any of those thoughts have changed as we've gone through the discussions. But trying to think about, from an objective standpoint, and you can mark them down on your paper and then we'll talk about them in a couple of minutes. You don't have to number them all, but if they're the ones that you want to put at the top, or if it's ones that you think are least important for the plan to have a focus, if you want to put lower numbers to that, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 10, a round number. If we could think about that for a few minutes, and then.
I think it all almost ties every one of them together, if you think about it.
I'm not going to disagree with you on that one, but if they're all equal, I am all for it. But I also know that there may be some that pop up. Tell me more what you're thinking there. Good.
It's like people want open space, natural resources. But if you have the infrastructure and accessibility and mobility to that, helps with your health and well-being, and it helps sustain the community.
And
And if
sustain,
those are connected to the residential and non-residential land uses, then it all comes together.
so whole picture, you're all for it.
Yeah.
And sustainability here is not just conservation or, sort of, maybe something you may be, immediately coming to your mind. It could be fiscal sustainability. It can be material sustainability. It could be sort of even process, like, right? I mean, some of the policies.
I kind of agree with you. They all tie together. One works with another.
Right.
You can't have just one without interfering with the other or making
It makes it all better.
Right.
Essentially.
if it's
Plan for
if it's all done properly, I think everything on this page seems to work together to make the community better. I think you pretty much addressed a lot of the issues that we're thinking about.
Is there anything that you see as potentially missing on the list?
Not right now, but I'm
Okay,
sure
yeah.
if I go home and look at this for a couple of hours, I might.
Yes, understood.
So-
And I wanted to give you time, because what we wanted to start doing is also for our meeting next time, and actually, by March, I believe, we're gonna be thinking about some draft work with you. So
Okay.
over the next couple of months, we wanted to develop these ideas,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Yeah.
definitely.
I would like to interject something here, and don't
Certainly.
take this as a negative thing. I would like to have you give us an agenda for these meetings like this. I would have liked to have
Oh,
seen this,
part of it.
during the week so I could digest it. I mean,
Understood.
I'll probably go home and think of 20 things I'd like to ask about it. I'm used to having a meeting with an agenda, so it gives everybody time to think about what we're going to talk about. So is there any possibility that we could have an agenda before a meeting?
Certainly, yes.
Okay, I would appreciate that. I don't know whether
Yeah,
anybody
that'd
else
be-
thinks about it this way, or that's my thoughts.
Because that's what I did
I-
over the past month with last month's handouts.
Right.
Just going through it, just
Yeah.
brainstorming.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to see some of these before the meeting, and have some ideas or questions, and 'cause then we leave this meeting, think, oh, why didn't I ask that? So I think an
Understood.
agenda would solve, at least to me it would. If you could do that, I would appreciate that,
I will do
okay?
that. Yes.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. So with that, we can then, I think, have some time with these, because if that's something in the next couple of weeks, you would want to share any feedback with us as
Okay.
well. And then we can think about how we craft some of these out, right? And sort of what each of them either may have, because I think where we're trying to consider, since the potential with the development ideas and possibilities in these different areas and the impacts that they may create, the considerations for redevelopment, these connectivity pieces that you guys have focused on, and appreciating this big picture consideration, right? And sort of holistic, if I may say. The breadth of this comprehensive plan is something that we want to be readable. We want it to be usable for all of the kinds of things that you could ultimately go after in your pursuits, right? And that dialogue next time is gonna help us also consider almost how we wanna even structure. That's our job, right? I mean, on the backside of this is to structure this comprehensive plan, but you guys have given us quite a number of ideas to think about, and we were trying to think about how they can come together smoothly as well. I think we did have one other consideration, given that what we're up, that 950 folks that have participated, that this springtime, we'd like to be able to get back out and see people again, because we're gonna have these ideas, right, and that type of thing. So I didn't know if that's something with the recreation department that we could either coordinate, or other meetings that you all may have. I would love it if we as a committee could also do something sort of together, if that's of any interest to you, and then, coming months, not in maybe the cocoa time, but
Is it possible to compile a lot of these ideas that we've collectively come up with to put that back out for people in the community to look, be like, huh, maybe we could build off of their ideas?
yes. And so I think that's where I was thinking about just sort of this package, right? Because the level of interest that exists within the community, again, is quite varied, right? So we are going to get anticipate a lot of feedback. I believe 1,100 people have viewed the meeting from last month. So there are a lot of people that are thinking about a number of things. So the way in which that we could almost do sort of the expanded working draft of the ideas to get out to them, if is that what the
Yeah.
kind of thing that you're thinking about? So we could put that in front of you all as a group before we do that, so that you can take a look, make sure we're on the right track, and then get that out to the public. Is there anything prior to sort of that, is there a bunny time, or is there something in the springtime maybe that we can work with as
Check
well?
with Dan, maybe.
I don't know off the top of my head.
No worries. So we will think about that. And why don't we, along with the packet, then put together a sort of winter, springtime detailed schedule.
Yeah,
So maybe we
they're
can get that
critical
to work
Yeah.
out and hit one of the points. So, all right. One item, just maybe make note on your sheet of objectives. The materials management, that last one, that last item, that's really looking sort of at the operational side of the township, meaning from resources, both personnel. I mean, we've been talking about what would it take from a personnel side to be able to comfortably, adequately, and with quality delivery, right, be able to offer these things out and to manage the system, and knowing that may mean different things from sort of a roles and responsibilities perspective, as well as even just whether it's public works or public safety, right? We've got sort of that operational side of things. So that one's a broader category. Just wanted to let you know that it probably stems into a couple of different things with the public works, the public safety, and then the other roles and responsibilities is the operational kinds of things. Okay. So with the new year then, these are the kinds of things we wanted to start to put in front of you as we get the ideas rolling. And then you have time to consider them as we come back together. I did get a picture of your ideas. So if anyone else has any ideas that they want to sketch out on any of their maps and share with us, that would be wonderful. I think, Harry, the other thing that we could pass on
Yeah, look at
is
your
we
numbers to
will
see how you-
download
Mhm.
the
I didn't fill that out.
updated
I just wanted to see
public
where you stood.
feedback that we've gotten through the survey, so that you can add that in, and we can, I don't think there's many changes to the pattern of what people have said. We've just sort of gotten some more reinforcement on the different ideas. So, but
Interesting.
nevertheless, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Carolyn, may I ask, because this is a new concept or a new comprehensive plan here. Do you have a tentative time frame of when a layout of events, or when a draft, or when it could be finalized and presented to the planning commission and to the board of directors or board of commissioners?
Yes, based on our fall discussions, we are keeping that same course, and we're anticipating that sort of in the April timeframe that we are going to be able, at the latest, be talking to Planning Commission. We were going to create actually a pre-packet for them that would go along, I think, with what you were thinking about, sort of prior to it getting out to the public, that they would have a chance to also give some feedback. So you as a committee giving some feedback in March, and then have planning commission sort of fit into that March, April timeframe as well. The consideration then for it, all the while, I think, given that we're gonna be ramping up with actually sort of culmination of some ideas, that the board would sort of have that as like a status report. So if there's anything that we want to make sure we fold into it before it goes out to the public in the spring, then we would be doing that. So I think June is what you asked us to sort of stick with, right, in terms of that sort of board timeframe. So that's where we are anticipating we still are.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. The planning commission is going to have to implement a lot of these things and act on them. So I think to have a meeting with them, I'm a member of that board, to explain to them, I report back to them on every meeting, but, you know, they're going to want to know a better idea of what we're really talking about, because, as I say, these people are going to want these changes, and they're going to come through the planning commission. So
Yes.
we need to keep them up to date, the rest of the board members, as to what we're talking about, how it may impact, you know, the future of the township. But I think that's a good idea.
And that piece, I think, where I was asking Ryan a question a little bit ago, or sort of that idea of beyond best practices, it's technically how would could some of this work, right?
Right.
If it were evolving into a series of criteria within the zoning ordinance, it's not writing it in zoning ordinance language, but it's sort of doing that one step back from it, where it's saying, these are the kind of criteria that could then go along with it. And if it were something where it's recommended, you know, that these are requirements versus these are recommendations, or, you know, these are complements to it, whether that's an, you know, an
Yeah,
incentive
'cause
to have.
we're going to have to deal
additional-
with how it's going to impact neighbors. There's a lot more in depth that's going to come out of this
And-
that our commission's going to have to deal with, and people are going to be here wondering, you know, how are we going to do mixed land developments, and how is there going to be commercial stuff right beside my driveway, or, you know?
Sure, and there, I think one of the things that we heard in the fall, and you guys had as part of the feedback, in which continues to be, it sustains an idea
Right.
of like buffer yards, right? And sort of what those mean. And I'm anticipating that there could be quite a number of comments related to what do buffer yards mean in the North Huntington Township landscape years from now, when potentially there is that mixture of use,
Right.
or there is that nature of something that may be connecting. And sometimes connectivity can be scary to people, and sometimes it can be very welcoming to people, right? So the ways in which we can deal with those two different thoughts and acknowledge that they both exist, and the reasons for them existing are also very different, right?
I think education will be a very important part, because change, people get nervous about.
They don't-
They think it's going to ruin their lifestyle.
We're human
When if you
beings.
really think about it, it enhance them. You know, it could be good for them. But change is a very scary thing around here
It
for
sure
people.
is. It's in a lot of different places. I don't think
Right.
North Huntington may be that different in that regard. But I think the point that I started to consider between sort of, again, elevated above sort of best practice, it's the why. And if we can think about the why within this comprehensive plan, and maybe then that turns into the scale to which, you know, a set of ordinance items, you know, gets pursued, or how deep those kinds of criteria go to address the things that have a certain level of
Education is
concern.
very important to
Right.
this.
And being,
The more information they get and understand it, then it's accepted.
so do you think there would be a value, or, pardon, I believe the answer is yes. If there were opportunity within the comprehensive plan to almost have a couple of pages every now and then, or, you know, a breakout, where there is, so it's just, it steps back and looks at an issue at sort of at a high level, right? And explores the kind of discussion that we're having. Before getting into, you turn the page and then talking about some specific techniques or, you know, getting into that. So that we're making sure we're identifying that there are things that are sort of baseline elements that either people have expressed throughout this process or that we've explored throughout this process. And there's a motive in a good way
Right.
to get at some of the stuff. And then continue forward with, and this is the way in which different things could be done.
Yeah. If it's presented properly, I think it'll be more acceptable to most people.
So I think what I'm taking also, and I appreciate what you're saying, is in the next month or two, in maybe February's meeting, is we think about sort of this outline of the comprehensive plan, and I don't mean just an A and a B and a C, but we have a pretty extended outline so that we can make sure we're hitting on maybe some expanded discussion about certain topics, ones that we know that are going to be pretty important to people, and that we've sort of we've flushed that out a little bit before we move on, you know, to the next topic. So I'm thinking about I don't want to say layout, but
Yeah,
sort
if
of.
if it's presented properly, I think it'll be much easier to let the people or convince the people to accept it. And
I
that's-
think people need to know the why
Yeah.
first, like you mentioned, why you made this decision. Because the how, they don't care.
Yep.
It's gonna be technical, it's gonna get muddy, it's gonna get, right? It's gonna be confusing to people. They wanna know the why you chose open spaces and some high density stuff versus expand Route 30, right?
Right.
The why is gonna be what drives the communication with the community.
Okay. I can appreciate that comment because not too many days ago, I was presented with 3 sentences, and I'm going to get to your thing here in a second. And the question that was posed to me was, of these 3 sentences, which one do you think had the was most received, or abided by? And the first one, this has nothing to do with planning, by the way, but a bit of fun. The first one was, may I please cut in line? I need to make copies. I need to make 5 copies. And the second sentence was, may I please go in front of you? I need to make 5 copies because I'm in a hurry. And the third one was, may I step in front of you? I need to make 5 copies because I need to get back to my house, right? What do you think the receptivity of the first statement was, the second one and the third one, like on a percentage basis?
First one, no good. Nobody likes the word cut.
Yeah, that's a bad word.
Yep, that was not the best word, that's right.
Interesting.
So the first one was actually not, it was received, 60% of the people said yes to the first one. But it wasn't because of cut, it was because they just were being kind. Like they were like, all right, this person has like 5 copies. Like it's not going to take that long. Go ahead, I'm not going to worry about it. The second sentence, because I'm in a hurry, I think is something right when I said, I guess I'm in a rush. 93% of the people let that person in front of them.
Wow.
The third sentence, so in the second sentence, they said because, right? And then the third sentence was because I need to get back home. So like they gave a little bit more specific, like, and thinking, okay, I'm going to pull on the idea of I have an important place to go, like a significant place to go. I mean, we all have important things to do, right? It was 94%. So there was a very vague reason, because I'm in a rush, like okay, just go, versus because I need to get home. very, very minor, but the difference is because they said because. So I'm sharing this only because you're identifying the why. It didn't matter what the why was in this case of copies, but it was the engagement of people had an interest in, and they had an understanding, and building that understanding of what was on the other side of that for them. So I'm taking that in a positive way here, because we're going to be able to do that and provide that background piece for some of the, things down the road for the people to consider. And knowing that we want the comprehensive plan to be full of things that are very doable and that are receptive to people doing them. But we also need to know from like that mission side, things are going to change, so they need to be flexible enough to be able to go along with it. So I'll take that because of yours, the why. All right, so with that, what's my little thing for this evening? Thank you very much. All right, let us know, and we will send out all that packet and the timeline. Thank you very much.
Okay.
See everybody next month.
Okay. Guess we have a planning commission meeting next month, too?
We will.
Okay, good.
Yep, we will, February 6th, I believe.
All right.